Welcome to the Heavy Duty Parts Report. My name is Jamie Irvin, and we are live. Did you know that every week we publish a podcast on heavydutypartsreport.com as well as on podcast players of your choice and YouTube? Go over to heavydutypartsreport.com to check out our podcast and make sure that you sign up to our weekly email list. That way you get notified of new podcast episodes and of our upcoming live interviews. We want to make sure you don't miss out on any content. So head over to heavydutypartsreport.com. There's buttons there to subscribe to the podcast player of your choice, YouTube, our social channels. But you can also sign up to our email, and you can just view all of this content on heavydutypartsreport.com. Today, I want to talk about a subject that really got my attention, and it just kind of blew my mind. And what are we talking about? Well, we're talking about a recent article that says that EVs, electric vehicles, have greater emissions than diesel-powered trucks. What is going on? While we have this conversation today, we'd love for you to participate in the conversation because I know you've got an opinion about this. So feel free to comment or to ask any questions. We'll do our best to incorporate you in today's episode. I'm going to introduce to you my guest today, who is Taryn Hohenson. Now, Taryn is the Heavy Duty Parts Report's audio video engineer and producer. Taryn, welcome to the podcast. So glad to have you here.
Thanks, Jamie. I love being here.
So this is a PG rated show, but when I saw this headline, it made me want to swear, like WTF. I'm going to read you a recent headline. California math shows internal combustion beating electric on emissions. We've got to unravel this, Taryn, so let's get into it. I'm going to read you something from the report, and then I'd like to get your feedback on it. So here's what we read in the report. Not all electric trucks will fall behind their internal combustion counterparts because of long charge times. Some will deliver impressive gains so long as they don't stray beyond their range and require a trip to the charger during the workday. Well, we know with commercial vehicles, that's not that many vehicles. That's just the inner city, urban vehicles, maybe last mile delivery. Everybody else is going to be outside of those ranges. So this affects a huge amount of the industry. The report goes on to say, however, where they are losing, meaning electric vehicles, according to the California Air Resource Board, or CARB, is in the more critical race to lower emissions. So what I got from that is electric vehicles inside of their range, they do great things. They get outside of their range, and it's a big problem. But even all of that being said, they're not lower emissions than diesel-powered trucks. How is that possible? Can you translate this for me? What does this all mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I thought that was crazy too when I read that they're losing that race to lower emissions. I was like, what? I thought they were leading it. But when we read this article, I remember when you sent me it, it like talked about how the data was released recently by CARB, how it indicated that these low carbon fuels like renewable diesel and biodiesel, they're actually rendering the best reductions in transportation-related sources of greenhouse gas emissions. So they're actually leading
the way. So, I mean, I get that traditional fossil fuel is not what we're talking about here when we say diesel powered. So traditional fossil fuel is still the worst when it comes to emissions. But it sounds to me from this report that things like biodiesel is actually our best bet, but you'd never know it from everything you see in the news, right?
No, absolutely. I really didn't know much about it until you sent me over this article. And I really liked how it talked about it. I saw this little quote in there. Let me see what it says. Oh, yeah. It says, when it comes to tackling the climate change, these new findings underscore the large and significant role that these low-carbon bio-based diesel fuels are playing in California today. So, of course, this was taken in California. This report was done there. So that's where they're doing a lot of research on this. But we should be really looking into this all over the place for the future because it's really important that we lower these emissions. And this seems like a really good alternative.
Right. Like when I think of the heavy duty parts industry, I think of the trucking industry. I mean, this has been a subject of great concern for many people. We've done entire webinars on it. How long will the diesel engine last? What does the future look like? Is electric going to replace everything? And from a parts perspective, when you start to look at just electric vehicles, like Bill Murth from IPD said, you open the hood and there's not much there. So as an engine parts manufacturer, they're concerned. I remember all the way back in episode 4 of the Heavy Duty Parts Report 2 years ago, Bob Hicks, who's the president of Marathon Brake, he said, hey, look, traditional brake friction material, it's going by the wayside, especially when they look at electric vehicles. So electric vehicles is not all that friendly to the parts business. Now you see this and you think to yourself, okay, maybe there is more to the story than we've been led to believe. So if biodiesel is potentially the solution, what is it exactly, and how much of an impact is it actually having on emissions? Because there was some data released by CARB to give us an indication of exactly the impact biodiesel has had, let's say, over the last decade.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said before, like, I didn't know much about biodiesel. I didn't really know what went into it, but I remember there's this quote. I'll just read it to you. It's really short, and it's from the National Biodiesel Board, and it says biodiesel can be produced from plant and animal matter. So it's a pretty renewable source. And from 2011 to 2020, California reduced their emissions by 43% by using biodiesel over traditional fossil fuels. While compared to electric vehicles, they only reached 13% in that same time frame.
That's a huge differential. I mean, 30%, that is doubling the impact every 3 years. But some people will say, okay, but in the last 10 years, like how many electric vehicles are actually on the road? And how many diesel engines are on the road? There's a huge difference. Doesn't that explain the disparity? But it actually doesn't. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, it really doesn't explain it, because we need to keep in mind that electric vehicles are really only as efficient and as green as the power sources that power them. So when we compare them, like we can't just measure only the vehicle, but we also need to take into consideration these power plants and the effect that they're having on emissions and the carbon footprint that they're leaving behind. So when you make that calculation with everything involved, well, biodiesel is coming out ahead.
So even if more electric vehicles are manufactured, which they're going to be as we approach some of the targets that CARB has set out for 2030, it doesn't scale, because the reality is that the power source, the power plants that generate the electricity that we charge these electric vehicles with, if you take that into consideration, biodiesel comes out ahead. So more electric vehicles isn't necessarily the total solution here.
No, definitely not.
It's funny because something tells me that the current administration and governments, both in the US and Canada, are not going to want to talk about this. And certainly electric vehicle marketing is not going to be talking about this. So like how do we see how do we create a fair comparison between something that burns fossil fuel, biodiesel, or is powered by electricity? How is it that we properly should be measuring the impacts?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, for one, like, I thought it was funny that there's a reason people don't really know about biodiesel, because they don't want them to know about biodiesel. That's why I didn't really know much about it until recently. But everyone wants to use the well to wheels method to measure vehicles that burn fossil fuels to see how efficient they are truly. But when we look at it, we aren't seeing the same method being applied to electric vehicles. And it's kind of shocking. So we think that they should be doing a fair and even comparison, like apples to apples comparison. So in other words, when you do a well to wheels comparison for fossil fuels, we should also be doing a power source to wheel for EVs to really level the field, to really truly understand the effect that lowering emissions they have.
Yeah, that's right. So, with fossil fuel, the minute that they start drilling into the ground until that fuel is put in the vehicle and that vehicle emits its exhaust, that's what they measure with fossil fuel. And they say, look at the impact. And then with EVs, it's like they're like, well, we don't really need to measure the power source. Like we'll just measure the vehicle because it has no tailpipe. So obviously it's so much better. But when you actually look at the data and you actually look at the amount of a impact the power generation has on the environment, it's a different story. So that to me tells me that we need some more research, we need more data to truly understand the actual impact that EV is going to have. And if it's not going to be the silver bullet magic thing that's going to save everything, then we need to be looking at these alternatives. And it sounds like biodiesel has, we have real reason to believe that it's a clear winner.
Yeah, definitely. I'm everything I'm reading about it seems to be pretty positive.
And what I found kind of interesting is where we got this article from was our friends over at truckpartsandservice.com. So Lucas Deal, thanks so much for publishing, having one of your writers publish such a great article. But what I kind of got from that is that biodiesel, in essence, is actually a solar powered energy source. Can you explain that?
Oh yeah, you picked my favorite quote from there. I really like that part too. Like how the CEO of Optimus Technologies, he put it this way when he said that biodiesel is created, for example, it can be created from soybeans, which is really being powered through the sun when you think of it, because soybeans grow because of the sun. So really, it's really efficient way. So basically, when you think about it, when you are using biodiesel in a truck, in a sense, you are driving a solar truck. Just a little bit slightly different way of solar energy.
Right. It's just a different way of harnessing the energy from the sun, because of course the sun powers the photosynthesis process with the plants, and then we use the plants as the fuel source. We burn them. It's a clean emission, and it actually produces a really great result. Especially, I mean, and we're not saying electric vehicles don't reduce emissions. They do, but none of us are saying we want to continue to burn fossil fuel. But what I'm seeing here is I'm seeing that EVs aren't the one solution that's going to solve the entire problem. And really that's good news for the industry, because there is issues with range. There is issues with sufficient electricity. I mean, California, they shut down. They have rolling brownouts in the summertime because the heat goes up. Everybody's using their AC and there's not enough power. So we can't just rely on electricity. And if all of the millions and millions and millions of vehicles get switched over to electricity, there's no way the grid can keep up. So we need alternatives. This is good news.
Yeah, absolutely. And with California's issue with power, and for example, in Canada, all the empty space without power charging stations, like if you're traveling through the mountains, there's not a whole lot of places, to charge a vehicle if it doesn't have very much range. So I think looking into these biodiesels, it's pretty important.
And one thing that's interesting is converting a vehicle, a diesel engine, from, let's say, from fossil fuel to biodiesel involves a few changes to the engine, but it's not a massive significant change. So we can actually repurpose existing diesel engines to use biodiesel, which of course is in essence, it's just elongating the lifespan of those vehicles without having to go and mine all the natural resources to make a new vehicle. So if we can actually convert existing vehicles, that's going to have a big positive impact as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you really like your truck, well, you don't have to get rid of it. You can just put a tiny bit of work into it to make it compatible with biodiesel, and you're good to go.
That's right. So, I mean, EVs are not the perfect solution. Biodiesel is not the perfect solution. It all has an impact. We need to continue to get good quality data, but this gives me a sense of optimism, because for the industry, assuming that biodiesel does become a more significant part of the solution and is getting as much support in the future from government and from industry as EVs is today, that technology is only going to improve. Things are only going to get better. And it's good news for repair technicians and for parts people.
Yeah, and I'm really excited to see where it takes us in the next few years, to see where not only biodiesel but electric cars. I want to see where this is going.
Well, I mean, that's the one thing about these kinds of big global issues. We're all in it. As they say, there's really no getting off this rock for most of us. So I guess time will tell, and we'll see where it takes us.
Yep, we definitely will.
All right, Taryn, thanks so much for being on the show and helping me cover this important subject. Looking forward to having you on the next time.
Thanks, Jamie.
All right, we'll talk to you later, Taryn. You've been watching the Heavy Duty Parts Report. I'm your host, Jamie Irvin, and we've been speaking with Taryn Hohenson, who's our audio video engineer and producer of the Heavy Duty Parts Report. Next week, we're going to discuss how to save big on credit card fees. So head over to heavydutypartsreport.com, sign up to our weekly email if you haven't already, subscribe to the show, and we look forward to talking to you next week. Have a great weekend. Thanks so much for tuning in. Bye-bye.